All right, let's talk about the Exodus. It's one of the most famous stories of liberation ever told. But what if the story we all think we know, slaves rising up against a powerful pharaoh, isn't actually the whole story? Today, we're going to dig into a historical investigation that completely reframes this entire epic event.
So let's just get right to the heart of it. This is a central question for our whole explainer. Was the Exodus really a slave rebellion? Or was it something totally different, like the forceful eviction of a foreign ruling class by the land's native people?
To even begin to understand this, we have to rewind the clock. We've got to go back to a time when Egypt wasn't one big, unified kingdom. Instead, it was a land literally split in two by a really deep and long-running political divide.
So, for centuries, Egypt was basically two separate countries sharing a border. Down in the south, you had the native Egyptian kings. They were ruling from their capital at Thebes. But up north, in that super fertile Nile Delta, a foreign group, the Hyksos, was in charge. They ruled from their capital, Avaris. And believe me, these Hyksos are absolutely central to our story.
Now, this wasn't some brief occupation. The Hyksos ruled northern Egypt for about 250 years, 2.5 centuries. You can just imagine the kind of deep, slow-burning resentment that built up among the native Egyptian kings down south. It was this long, simmering Cold War, just waiting for a spark.
And that spark, well, it was fanned by some really intense religious conflict. See, the Hyksos rulers were pushing the worship of their god, Seth, and sources say they were destroying symbols and punishing anyone who followed the native Egyptian gods. And this is where a fascinating theory comes in. What if the figure we know as Moses wasn't a Hebrew slave, but was actually a high priest inside the Hyksos religious system?
For 250 years, this stalemate just held. The Hyksos were just too powerful to be kicked out. But then something happened that nobody could have possibly predicted. An event that had nothing to do with man, but everything to do with nature.
So what was it? What was this massive, cataclysmic trigger that completely broke the deadlock and changed the course of Egyptian history forever?
The event happened right around 1570 BC, a moment in time that would send shockwaves, and I mean that quite literally, all across the ancient world.
It was the Minoan eruption of Thera, which you'd know today as the island of Santorini. We're talking about one of the biggest volcanic eruptions in all of human history. And this single, massive explosion in the Mediterranean, it set off a chain of events that would lead directly to the downfall of the Hyksos kingdom.
Okay, and this is where the story gets really interesting, because the fallout from this one eruption can be scientifically linked to the famous 10 plagues we all know from the Bible.
Let's just trace this incredible chain reaction. First, the volcanic ash shoots into the atmosphere, blacking out the sky, causing darkness and wild rainstorms. Second, the volcano's collapse triggers mega tsunamis that come crashing into the Nile Delta. Third, all that salt water poisons the fresh water supply. And finally, that leads directly to widespread famine and disease. A sequence of plagues, all starting from one single geologic event.
So for the Hyksos up north, this was an absolute catastrophe. Their entire infrastructure was crippled, their power base was just crumbling. But for the native Egyptian kings down south in Thebes, watching all this unfold, it was, as the source material calls it, an auspicious moment. This was the opening. This was the window of opportunity they had been waiting on for 250 years.
And you better believe they didn't waste it. What came next wasn't some quick little uprising. No, this was a brutal, multi-generational, 30-year-long war to take back their homeland. The whole campaign kicked off around 1564 BC, led by Pharaoh Seqenen-Re-Tao, and the fighting was absolutely vicious. Both he and his first son, Kamose, were killed in battle. So the mission to finish the war fell to the second son, Ahmose I, who, around 1534 BC, launched the final, decisive assault on the Hyksos capital of Avaris.
So, let's put some names to the faces here. On one side, you've got the Theban dynasty, Seqenen-Re-Tao, his son Kamose, and finally, the ultimate victor, Ahmose I. And on the other side, you have the last of the Hyksos kings, Api and Kamudi, just fighting desperately to hold on to their 250-year-old kingdom.
So, you have to ask, why did the Egyptians win now? What changed? Well, for centuries, the Hyksos had a huge military advantage, horses and chariots. But all that environmental chaos from the eruption, the flooding, the mud, the famine, it completely neutralized that advantage. The chariots were useless, bogged down in the mud. The horses were starving. It totally leveled the playing field, and it allowed the Theban army to finally overwhelm them.
So, with their capital under siege and their army totally defeated, the Hyksos were routed. What happened next wasn't an escape of slaves, it was a mass flight of the entire defeated ruling class. This was an exodus of rulers.
Now, to avoid being completely wiped out by Ahmose's army, the fleeing Hyksos made a really smart strategic move. They split up. The remnants of their army retreated northeast into Gaza, where they actually held out under siege for another 3 years. But meanwhile, the civilian population, we're talking the aristocracy, the priests, the merchants, led by that figure of Moses, they fled southeast, making a break for the Red Sea.
And this all brings us to the final and maybe the most stunning reinterpretation in this whole story. And it all centers on one of the most famous lines from the Bible.
You know the line. It says that as the Hebrews left, they plundered the Egyptians, taking gold and silver and all sorts of valuables. Now, in the traditional story, we see this as slaves taking back wages for generations of unpaid labor, right? But if they weren't slaves, then what in the world does this mean?
This is the crucial point. They weren't slaves taking what they were owed. They were a defeated aristocracy, a foreign ruling class that had been in charge for 2.5 centuries, and they were taking their accumulated wealth with them as they fled into exile. They were literally packing up the treasury and getting out of town.
Here's a really great modern analogy to help wrap your head around this whole thing. Imagine a huge, powerful corporation has been a tenant in a building for decades. The landlord has always wanted them out but could never do anything about it. Then, a massive flood, that's our volcanic eruption, damages all the tenants' expensive equipment. Suddenly, the landlord has the leverage to finally evict them, and as they're being kicked out, the corporation packs up and takes all of their valuable assets with them.
When you look at the historical and the geological evidence, it presents this incredibly compelling alternative to a story we all thought we knew so well. It transforms it from a tale of slaves to a story of a falling kingdom, a changing of the guard, a dynasty evicted by a war and a volcano. And it just leaves you wondering, if a story this foundational can be so completely reframed, what other parts of history are not quite what they seem?